Well, listeners, we are already having some fun. It's all technology, which is amazing because there are so many astonishing things going on in the world right now. And I personally am freaking out about, okay, which button do I need to push? What do I need to do? Here's my guest smiling very patiently. I'm Dr. Melanie Harth. I'm pretty sure that that is still true. The show is called Living from Happiness, where we talk about how to navigate the waters of these transformational times. The station is KSFR 101.1. Financial expert Doug Lynam is back in the studio, or in this case, from his office to me from my office, and we're videotaping the whole thing and audio recording it for the show later today. Welcome back, Doug.
Thanks, Melanie. It's great to be back.
This is show number 2 in what you and I just sort of creatively decided was going to be an initial 4-part series called Dancing with the Devil. Listeners, you can download podcasts of earlier shows by going to the station's website at ksfr.org, including last week's show, which was somewhat funky in terms of the audio as we're figuring our stuff out on the ground as we go. This week is much better. Let me introduce you first, Doug, okay, quickly. You have a long bio. Among other things, you were a Benedictine monk for 20 years. You're a money manager. You're the author of a wonderful book, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, called From Monk to Money Manager, a former monk's financial guide to becoming a little bit wealthy and why that's okay. And here we are, recording this series still as the COVID-19 virus has not yet reached its peak in the United States, or globally, perhaps. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough data about how and why the world is falling apart as it seems to be doing. What do you want to say about that, Doug, before I start asking you questions, or is that not fair?
That's a big question. Happy to try to jump in on that one, but I don't know if we have enough time to cover all that. Is there a specific...
I do. Well, so let me do this. What I'd like to do is, I think let's just leave you off the hook about that huge existential. I mean, if you could answer that, maybe we'd be on a beach. I would be on a beach under a palm tree with no coconuts that we fall down, and it would be lovely. And here we are. Here we are, feeling unsafe. At least I am a lot, or I can be feeling unsafe. I want to start today's show kind of tagging on the tail end of last week's show when I asked you for some advice or counsel for what folks might do very quickly right now in the moment. And what I remembered you advising was take some action. There are a lot of assistance programs available right now. There's unemployment for a lot of folks. Unemployment definitions are being expanded. And there's a stimulus package and some stimulus funds available for folks. And what I personally did as a result of that show is I haven't lost all of my income, but I have lost some of my income, trying to figure out what does that look like? What does that mean? I don't have a restaurant that's closed. I have a private practice as a psychologist, and clients are understandably freaking out because we're all freaking out financially. So what I did was start doing some research about that. And what I also did was get very, very scared about talking to my landlord. I'm a renter right now, terrified of talking to my landlord about, is there any way we might work together?
Right.
My traumatized brain, folks, go back to download last week's show, trauma brain. When there is trauma in the zeitgeist, in the collective, this coronavirus pandemic is traumatizing. If we have been traumatized in the past, especially as a child, as I was, and as you shared, you were as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
My amygdala, the portion in my brain where fear resides is like this all the time. Hyper alert, hyper vigilant. My landlord is a nice guy. He's never done anything to freak me out, but my brain went into freak out.
Yeah.
Freak out, freak out, freak out. I had to manage those emotions and my fears enough to find the courage to actually go have a conversation that lasted, the basic conversation lasted less than 2 minutes.
Hmm.
I started crying, of course, I started crying. And he said, sure,
Yeah.
sure, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
But you were so helpful in encouraging the ask,
Yeah.
finding the courage to make the ask. I'll stop now.
Well, yeah, I mean, because as you know, when we get into these very stressful situations, we end up into a fight, flight, or or freeze response, right? So there are lots of things you can do right now, but the worst thing you can do is to freeze up or even to flee these problems because they're at our doorstep and they aren't going to go away anytime soon. So it's a really good time to try to get into that fight mode and even engage some of the helpful stress, to use that to your advantage to push you into action. So talking to your landlord, talking to your bank. If you have a small business, there are loans available that are very, very generous and can help keep you afloat for a short period of time as we get through the crisis. And then also talking to credit card companies or anyone you owe money to at this point is going to be very understanding. And to remember that just as there are resources that have been put into place with the CARES Act, the bill that went through Congress recently,
Which is that
those
big stimulus
big
bill.
stimulus bill.
Yes.
So there are things there for you, but there are also just as many things on the other end, from the lender side, from the landlord side, from the credit card side. So they're getting there's a lot of things there that to help them mitigate the impact of the fact that you and I and other people out there may have trouble paying some of these bills and to keep everything afloat. So having those conversations and being able to sort of dig into that fight response a little bit and fight for what you need to get through this crisis in as sane and healthy a way as possible. And to remember that this is really going to be I think we need to be honest, embrace people for a long struggle. So it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So remember that and try to start taking those simple small acts that you can to kind of preserve your financial situation as best you are able and preserve your cash. And if that means that you need to negotiate either not paying your rent this month or paying a part of it, but as long as you're making a good faith effort and you're having those conversations, you aren't just ignoring it, then I think you're going to be okay. That you'll be able to either delay rent payments or get them reduced, or you can certainly get forbearance on student loans and mortgages, credit cards. All those things can just pretty much go by the wayside for a short period of time, but you have to have those calls and make those calls and have those conversations.
Yes, and I love what you said about digging into that fight response just a little bit. This is not the time to freeze. That little bunny in the middle of the road saying, I'm sure that truck does not see me. I'm fine. I'm good. I'm good. You're not good. You're flat. What do they call it? Yeah, you're flattened. To prepare for a long struggle. I will say that I also pay rent in town for my office space, which I am not now currently using, because it's not safe to do that. That landlord, already sent an email to all of her tenants explaining very carefully how to pay the full amount of rent. I didn't even have a conversation with her. I haven't yet. And she's been clear that I don't think it's going to be such an easy conversation with her. But from the psychological safety point of view and the emotional and the spiritual, because in fact, they're all completely intertwined. In fact, the word psyche comes from the ancient Greek and it means soul. It's our souls that we're talking about here and feeling safe. So my personal issue last week was in feeling safe enough to have a conversation that felt very hard for me to do. First of all, there's a lot of shame in not having a ton of money. This is a culture that has derived its power and in many ways its sense of identity, and we individuals have internalized those messages from money, our standing in the world. If you are a master of the universe, that old movie with Michael Douglas, I don't know, something about I think it was Wall Street, a long time ago, called Wall Street. You know, that's it. Of course, there's no place for the feminine, and we're not going to go there. But I had to dig a little deeper into that fight response, as you said earlier, Doug. And I'm talking about this perhaps a little bit too much in depth because these are basic psychological strategies that really we need to be developing, we need to be practicing, we need to be cultivating. If it feels scary and yet you're pretty sure, I wasn't contemplating robbing a bank, I just had to ask somebody in authority to work with me. And that can feel terrifying to the traumatized brain.
Right. And also, I think this is where, you know, the monastic practices or the spiritual practices of all world religions can be very, very helpful. Because in monasticism, we talk about the dark night of the soul. And that's a really difficult spiritual place. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. But it's when you get into that dark night of the soul where you feel so disconnected from meaning, from purpose, even from the divine or God, or whatever your spiritual practice may be. And then you're in this really dark space, as many of us are forced into deep isolation. Then to even reach out from that darkness or that fear space can be very, very difficult. And so I think we can explore maybe some of the psychological and spiritual tools that can help people get through that dark night and into a space where they can actually take some proactive measures on their own behalf. But you're going to have to be your own advocate right now. And it's just really a time, as you point out, to really dig a little deeper and find the courage and the strength to face these issues directly, because they're not going away, right? The truck is going to hit you.
Yep.
And
unless you get out of the way.
Well, yes, but I think this is where compassion is really helpful, is to remember that the root word for compassion, but what compassion literally means, is to suffer with, right? Co-suffering, and we're all suffering together. So this is a moment for great compassion for yourself and for the world, and to have that moment of solidarity with everyone on the planet who's going through this at the same time, and to realize that you are not alone. We're all going through it, and all the judgment that you have on yourself, all those anxieties, those wounds about failure, about not being able to pay a bill this month. It's like, you know what? No one cares in terms of your reputation, in terms of your ego. You got to get your ego out of the way and really dig into this and stop, or maybe it's impossible to stop the shame and the guilt. Those are going to be there, but to enter that place of acceptance.
To work with them, yes. And I'm interrupting you, and I apologize. We've got to take a quick break. Doug Lynam. This is great. When we come back, I want to keep talking more about this idea of how to get through the dark night of the soul, which, of course, I don't care how much money we have or how much money we don't have. We are, each of us in our own way, going through a dark night of the soul, I think. And collectively, oh, you bet we are. I'm Dr. Melanie Harth. The show is Living from Happiness. The station is KSFR 101.1. We will be right back. I'm Dr. Melanie Harth. The show is Living from Happiness. The station is KSFR 101.1. I'm talking really quickly because I'm all excited about this conversation we're having with Doug Lynam. Doug, former Benedictine monk and money manager, now author of the wonderful book From Monk to Money Manager. We were talking before we went to the break about some of the ways in getting that we can get through this dark night of the soul together, and you've already offered several terrific suggestions. I want to hit on my own little story, just that I shared first half very briefly. That scared, traumatized one of me that did not want to have what seemed to be a hard conversation about money and the unbelievably complex not so healthy to very dysfunctional relationship almost everybody in this culture has with money, which you write your book about, and your personal story very much touches on that. For me to have some compassion for that part of myself that was so scared about doing what needed to be done, in part, really, I have the money to pay the rent now, Jay, I do, sorry, but preparing for this long struggle that you were talking about as well, first half, I need to be smart and savvy and grounded in what my resources are, how long this thing may last, what might need to get into place now, when in fact the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet. So that self-compassion is a beautiful touchstone to have. Thank you for bringing that up. As well as your reminder, Doug Lynam, that we are not alone. We aren't alone. My hard conversation last week ended up very well because it did. But it's not always going to end up necessarily well or the way we want. But we at least have to dig into that fight response and say, wait a minute, I got to stand up for myself. I have to become my own advocate. Nobody's going to come down and save me. And at the same time, I have a lot of help. I have friends, I have internal resources, I have a spiritual practice, I have my radio show, I have my clients, I have my son, I have all kinds of things in my life that are very wonderful and good resources.
And I think you're touching on something important there, which is gratitude, right? How can we find that deep contemplative gratitude for the simple pleasures and the things that are most important to us in our lives, like the people we love? As we face illness and death in a very profound way, we're dancing with this devil of this virus that's just reshaping all of our lives in deeply profound ways. As we dance with this devil, is like, how can we find that gratitude for the simple pleasures and to embrace that love and that compassion that really is what makes life worth living and makes life joyful? And can you find that joy even now, even in the midst of great suffering? That's the heart of many of our spiritual practices, is not to ignore the suffering and not to try to dismiss it or flee from it, but to kind of, in many ways, I'll use my Christian metaphor because that's my background, but to embrace that cross, as we would say in Christianity, or Buddhism, right, would say that life is suffering. And so we see that as a theme across all world religions, is the fact that suffering is prevalent and unescapable. So it's really about how do we live with that suffering in compassion, in solidarity, and then also be able to take that mindful action to not make it any worse than it has to be, because it's going to be hellacious. There's no way, it's going to be tragic. Let me put it that way. There's a lot of tragedy coming our ways, but it does not need to be hellacious, right? Because even in tragedy, if there's love, if there's compassion, it can be difficult, but it doesn't need to be total hell. And so with that in mind, you need to remember, as I often say, God is not going to work a miracle to solve a problem that you have the power to fix. And you can't just wish it away. In other words, what are those resources, as you mentioned? What are the family, the friends, the deeper connections and resources that you can pull upon? Because now's the time more than ever that you see the value of those connections, those relationships, even as we're in isolation, to try to pull together even in very positive ways so that we can get through it together.
Yes, and you're reminding me of a point that is, from my perspective as a psychologist, a very important one. Excuse me, and that I inevitably work with every client who comes to me, and those are the internal resources. We are stronger than we understand. We have more resources and gifts and strengths and talents than we have oftentimes been allowed to own. So much of the work I do is helping people see who they actually are. And it's not even just the potential that's, 20 years in the future. It's like right there. Can you hear that about yourself? Can you own that ability can you move from that strength? Can you strengthen that gift like that? And one of the, well, living with suffering, wow, there's so many things I want to do and we're almost out of time. This always happens. Okay, so sorry, this is what I do when I'm like, okay, I have 3 different ideas at this very second. Okay, what are some of the other invitations, Doug Lynam? Because we've already been talking this whole show about some of the invitations that are showing up, coming through this pandemic crisis. And so much of it, I think, focuses around financial and money, because this culture has been built on that, which of course is a huge problem, issue, shadow, that because it hasn't been handled well from a spiritual perspective, I don't think. But there are still some very either screaming or whispering invitations coming to us through this crisis. What can you talk about that for a couple of minutes?
Sure. I think the invitations are well, a lot of it also depends on your personal circumstances. So for those of us who are in isolation and living alone, there's going to be this invitation to really go deeper if you have a contemplative practice, to go deeper into it, or start embracing it, whatever your tradition happens to be, and to use that as a way to sort of guide you through. Because the dark night of the soul is there are a lot of tools and techniques for getting through it, but one of the most important is to not avoid it. So the temptation is going to be to binge watch, and binge watching TV is great. Nothing wrong with it. I'm happy to do it myself.
I agree.
It's not a judgment on technology. It's simply saying it could be any distraction, right? And so not to distract your way out of your internal pain, or self-medicate your way out of it. So now's a really bad time, as we talked about last week, to reaching for alcohol or other drugs or other substances to try to mitigate the pain, because it doesn't make it go away. It's just going to come back much, much worse. You're compounding your suffering in that direction. And the other invitation, of course, is for those of us who are isolating with family. I suspect, I jokingly say that I think there's going to be more deaths from spousal attacks than there are going to be from the COVID-19 virus. So it's going to be an invitation to really learn to lean into these relationships and make them stronger, and find a way to navigate the stressors of being cooped up with your family and even your pets. I've got a new puppy whom I love, but if I clean up one more piddle stain on the carpet, I'm going to scream.
I know.
So how do you manage this stress? What's the invitation that we have to navigate that deep stress that we're being put under? And then lastly, those of us who are on the front lines in the medical profession, I'm sure feeling a great deal of overwhelmed feeling, or those with businesses that are shuttering. There's a lot of overwhelmness happening. So those are sort of 3 things that I think we can lean into and try to find our way through them rather than avoiding them. And we can maybe get into some techniques for that if you like.
Yes. And we have to do that next week, or we can add on our Facebook pages or social media, because we're out of time. Those are great suggestions.
I want to hear your thoughts on that too. Next week.
Next week, or I'm trying to think quickly, can I post some suggestions on Facebook? Let's do that next week. Listeners, we're going to start there next week. And I'm madly writing notes because we're out of time, and I may remember that I put those notes right here, and I may not. In the meantime, we are in this together. We will be on the other side of this when we're on the other side of it. In the meantime, we stay with what is, stay with how it is. We tell the truth to the best of our ability to do that. And there's my timer saying it's time to, oh, you might not be able to hear it, but the show's over. All right, that's a great place to leave it. Doug Lynam. I like this video stuff from Monk to Money. A wonderful book, A Former Monk's Financial Guide to Becoming a Little Bit Wealthy and Why That's Okay. Listeners, part 3 of this series, Dancing with the Devil, is next week. KSFR 101.1. I'm Dr. Melanie Harth. The show is Living from Happiness. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you, Melanie.
Listeners, as always, thank you so much for listening. Here's to your happiness.